Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. We brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. GSE's Wood Cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful. With GSES, Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway, following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive.
Dans ce contexte actuel de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la COVID-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous leur avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière Cashew, Technoserve, à travers Bénin Cashew, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de Technoserve pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné la TDA et Technoserve à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cashew que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou. Et ça a permis aux femmes des 2 Nord de participer. Je veux dire à Takora Donga, Bongo, Albori, Zoukoline, le centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cashew. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues, pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager les informations avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière cajou au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de Technoserve via le projet Bénin Cajou.
Le projet Bénin Cashew a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Béné Cashew a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité, que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout faire la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces 2 organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Bassila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Atta Kakayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur et ensuite qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local chez nous pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Founded in 2006, the African Cashew Alliance (ACA) is an industry alliance for both African and international businesses interested in promoting a globally competitive African cashew industry. It is a member-based organization whose members represent all aspects of the cashew value chain, including producers, processors, traders, and international buyers. At the African Cashew Alliance, our vision is to have a sustainable African cashew industry that delivers globally competitive value-added products and secures profitability for all. On a bigger scale, our mission is to create a platform for accelerating growth and investments in the African cashew industry through partnerships, advocacy, market linkages, technical support, and global networking. The African Cashew Alliance seeks to achieve its vision based on pertinent 4 pillars, which are to 1. Facilitate networking among members and offer timely information on the cashew sector. 2. Advocate for sector improvement and partnerships. 3. Facilitate food safety standards. And 4. Increase processing in Africa through investment promotion and technical support services. Are you considering exploring the cashew industry or already a stakeholder? The African Cashew Alliance invites you to become a member today. Membership at ACA provides diverse benefits including access to profiles of other ACA members for business-to-business and networking, an extensive database for cashew stakeholders, discounted conference and event fees, discounted technical assistance and business advisory packages, electronic newsletters, quarterly reports and analysis on the cashew sector, and many other benefits. We also offer services in line with having a sustainable African cashew industry. These include market information system, quality and sustainability seal, technical assistance to processors, investment support, and access to finance. The Global Market Encounter GME with Jim Fitzpatrick is an iForum brought to you by the African Cashew Alliance ACA. GME provides a unique platform for diverse stakeholders to challenge assumptions and learn while discarding information that is obvious to be false, separating facts from fiction, and providing an accurate and timely market update are the core mandates of the GME. The GME is a free bi-weekly webinar that takes place on Wednesdays at 9 a.m. GMT and brings together participants from both the private and public sectors, ensuring that a unique perspective is brought on board. The Cashew Master Training Program (MTP) is a tailored cashew training which consists of 3 one-week classroom and practical sessions that provide a facilitated platform for exchange, with the goal of creating a pool of technical and managerial expertise and facilitating regional exchange among cashew experts by sharing lessons learned and innovations at the regional and national levels. The Cashew MTP is designed for a sustainable industry. Trained experts in each country become resource persons for knowledge transfer in several areas, including agronomy and cashew orchard management, post-harvest management and cashew product quality, processing and value addition to cashew and its byproducts, market mechanism, nut and kernel market analysis, business relationships among stakeholders, value chain development, assistance with self-financing, among others. After 16 editions, the ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo has become the iconic cashew event in Africa and beyond. The ACA Conference offers a one-of-a-kind opportunity for African and international cashew industry stakeholders to come together and discuss industry challenges and opportunities, find solutions, construct and refresh partnerships to build a sustainable and competitive cashew industry. Several African cashew producing countries have hosted the ACA Annual Cashew Conference, notably Mozambique, Tanzania, Cote d'Ivoire, Gambia, Benin, Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, Tanzania, and Nigeria. For the 17th edition in 2023, The conference will be hosted by Senegal from the 18th to the 21st of September in the famous and vibrant city of Dakar. The ACA conference features plenary sessions by experts from all sectors of the cashew industry, thematic forums, numerous business-to-business meetings, World Cashew Expo, and a variety of networking and social events. Save the date and remember, all roads lead to Dakar, Senegal. Contact the African Cashew Alliance via mail aca@africancashewalliance.com or call +223 302 904951. You are welcome to meet the ACA team at its secretariat, situated on the 31 Boundary Road, East Legon, Accra, Ghana. For more information, visit the ACA's website www.africancashewalliance.com. Connect via Facebook at African Cashew Alliance, Twitter at African Cashew, and YouTube.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export, and we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin, les 2 hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacards du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more productive, competitive, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth engine for the people of Benin. It's being funded by the USDA and is being implemented by TechnoServe and our partners at CRS. Over 8 years, Benin Cashew will increase the yields and incomes of more than 49,000 smallholder farmers, triple Benin's domestic processing capacity, create more than 3,400 jobs, most of which will be held by women, and will position the entire sector for continued growth long after the project ends.
Technicien travaille avec des hommes et des femmes pour bâtir des fermes et des entreprises compétitives qui contribuent à la réduction de la pauvreté, à l'augmentation de la résilience des bénéficiaires et de leur communauté. Nous restons convaincus que la participation pleine et entière des femmes et des filles permet de maximiser la croissance économique inclusive pour un développement généralisé. Au sein de la production agricole et notamment dans la filière cajou, bien que présentes, les femmes sont confrontées à des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'accès aux facteurs de production, notamment la terre, les ressources financières, la technologie et les formations. Au début du projet Benin Cashew, la participation des femmes était d'environ 20,57%. À fin décembre 2020, ce taux est passé à 34,67% au sein de la production et à 39% au sein du projet. L'objectif étant d'atteindre au moins 40% de participation des femmes. Pour atteindre ce résultat, nous avons mis en place un dispositif institutionnel avec tous les partenaires du projet pour intégrer le genre au sein de toutes les activités de ce projet. Nous avons un dispositif basé sur des points focaux genre qui ont reçu des formations sur différentes techniques, différentes thématiques. Nous avons mené aussi un plaidoyer pour la modification des tests statutaires des fêtières, des producteurs de cajou afin d'alléger les conditions d'accès des femmes aux coopératives. Et nous avons pu avoir une femme présidente du conseil d'administration de la fêtière des producteurs d'anacarde et une femme présidente du conseil de surveillance de cette même organisation, ce qui est une première au Bénin au sein de la filière anacarde.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
J'ai constaté qu'avec cette formation, la femme a un grand rôle à jouer pour l'émancipation et la prospérité, bien partagée qu'à l'intérieur, qu'à l'extérieur, au sein du foyer. Grâce à cette même formation, la population, mais la communauté a un regard craintif en nous. Ils nous copient, ils voient la manière dont nous vivons avec mon épouse. Grâce à cette formation, nous avons pu réaliser beaucoup de choses.
Cette formation que nous avons eue sur le champ nous a réveillés par rapport à la femme, parce que dans le maillon production, on a constaté que les femmes n'ont pas assez à la tête, donc du coup, elles sont marginalisées. Donc sur le terrain, nous voyons à ce que les femmes sont prises en compte. Et comme le projet le recommande 40% de femmes, il faut dire que ce n'est pas facile, 40% des femmes dans tout ce.
Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa. 53% of the world's cashew.
Recording in progress.
Continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another session of the ACO Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. On behalf of the African Cashew Alliance, I appreciate every sponsor and partner who have continually made it possible for us to bring these sessions to you. And just before we begin with today's session, please be reminded that the session is being held in English with a simultaneous French interpretation. To access this service, kindly locate the globe icon on your screen. Select a preferred language and mute the original sound. And for all questions or need for clarification as the presentation is ongoing, please use the Q&A button. We will address this after the presentation. Now to the agenda of today. Please join me welcome Jim. Jim, good morning.
Good morning, Blessing. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Jim. How about you?
I'm good, thanks. Hello, everyone. You're very welcome. It's good to be with you. I hope you can see my screen. We're going to come back to a topic that we've talked about once or twice already this year, this idea of mixed messages and mismatches in the cashew sector, really trying to make sense of a year that's been disturbing, surprising, but in some ways predictable too. So we're going to divide this into a number of sections. We're going to start off and we're going to talk about where is the market today and how did it get here. Then we'll focus on demand, which seems to be a cause of much questioning in the market at the moment. And then we'll have a look to finish at some of the big questions for the rest of the year, where we might go and what might happen in the rest of the year. So let's start to think about where is the market now and how did we get to this position? And really, I think the question that's being asked is, are we in a long-term crisis? Quick look at the market news. Well, as most people will know, prices on kernels and on raw cashew nuts are lower. They've been falling for 3 to 4 weeks now, maybe stabilized in the last 10 days. Of course, at this time of year, it's quite difficult to judge. Trade is relatively thin. There's some prompt trade. RCN market is really quite a mess. We are looking at a situation certainly of lower prices, and that's undermining buyers' confidence, especially kernels buyers. They still lack confidence for a whole range of reasons, which I'll talk about as we go on this morning. There is a crisis in the RCN trade. Again, yet another crisis. Some people are making a lot of money out of it. Others are suffering quite a lot out of it. But it is, make no mistake, a continued crisis. The impact of these lower prices on cashew kernels hasn't really been felt yet. Even though there's mismatch in the kernels market and the raw cashew nut market, those mismatches are small compared to the mismatches between the FOB price of, let's say, W320s from Vietnam, for example, and retail and wholesale prices in destination markets, particularly in the Western markets. So this impact of lower prices has not yet been felt. How big that impact will be, well, we never know, and that remains to be seen. For sure, it's going to be bigger in some markets, perhaps the United States, than in others. Let's have a look at that again later too. And we know that all of this is resulting in a challenging situation for regulators, particularly in West Africa, but as the year goes on, also in East Africa, particularly in Tanzania, as this situation develops over the next 2 or 3 months. So we'll start by having a look at pricing. If you're regular on this webinar, you know I don't like really to start talking with pricing, but I think in the current situation we should do that. Here's the market over the last 20 years or so. It's a roller coaster. 3 huge bubbles and 2 major rallies in all cases, followed by sharp declines. Where are we today? Well, we're at the lowest prices for 320s, and these are 320s for reliable processors with good certification, and I normally take positions that are about 3 months forward shipment, and that's consistent over the entire period of the chart in front of us. So as I said, lowest prices since February 2009. We are about 12% below the 2-year average, so we're very much at the bottom end of the current scale. I think some of the prices we're seeing right now are some of the lowest prices of the 2-year average, though we were down to similar levels earlier in the period of the pandemic. We also saw similar levels around these 240, 245 levels from Vietnam for maybe some of the smaller shippers, but nonetheless, those goods are available. We're about 18% below the 5-year average. So this shows by any measure, cashew kernels are at very low prices, historically low prices. And here, of course, we're talking about absolutes. If we were to factor in real prices, particularly in the last 2 years with high inflation, then obviously cashews have lost a lot in terms of cost in destination markets. So I thought maybe what we should do is focus in on this speculative bubble 2016 to 2018 and just say, if we took that out of it, what would it mean? And if we took it out, excluding that period, July 16 to August 18, we would be today about 21% below the 10-year average. Factor in a little bit of inflation in there, and we really are looking at some very cheap cashew kernels indeed, compared to historical prices. Of course, you can't say they're cheap. Cheap is only a price that's lower than the price you can sell them at. But looking at the history, prices look very low at historically low levels. That doesn't mean they're going to bounce off anytime soon. Just because they're at historically low prices doesn't mean that any bounce will come quickly. But let's look at a few of the other factors to see if we can gain any clues as to when we might see a change in the market. So I thought, firstly, let's have a look at the last 5 years, and let's have a look at the trends in each year over the last 5 years. So we start with 2019, the last year that we might describe as a normal cashew year, if there is such a thing. In 2019, we saw relatively stable prices. They came down in the early part of the year as the last decline following the bubble of 2016 to 2018, and they stayed relatively stable in the course of the year. Following year, we saw prices come down early. This is 2020, so now we're talking about the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in the early part of the year. But after that, prices remained relatively stable and actually picked up from September onwards. 2021, the record year for cashew consumption in the world. We saw prices pick up as the year went on. And then, and I remember this so well, in September, October 2021, inexplicably, the market started to literally collapse. And it slipped right back down below $3. A heavy selling pressure from Vietnam, very difficult to explain. Demand was excellent. Demand continued excellent into the following year, last year. But during last year, as we got to mid-year, we started to see imports fall away. And that's been followed this year by a sharp decline. So this year looks, so far, most like 2022, which wouldn't be great news, but it also looks a little bit like 2021. So I would say that in the trends, it's very difficult to see if there's any kind of an annual seasonal trend from which we can draw some encouragement. most of the busy season buying is done. There are top-ups for Western markets, and there will be some further buying by India. But we've seen, particularly in June, big imports by China. So we may see some more top-ups. We may see some forward buying into next year. There is some shorts. There's plenty of short covering to be done. That's mostly importers. There's a lot of people talking the market lower. I'm not sure if they're just talking their books. And we see some of the publications, especially the European publications on the market, are really reporting essentially what their contributors want them to hear. And they're talking the kernels market down. But that's a very, very one-dimensional view of where the market may go. People are also saying that the summer is quiet. Actually, if you look at the way the market works, August can be quite a busy month on cashew kernels, especially for American buyers, especially as we get later into the month of August. So I wouldn't say that necessarily the theory of a quiet summer and further falls in prices is justified. I do think we're going to hear a lot of talk from buyers of kernels and importers talking about delaying high price shipments. Again, it's not the first time they've done that. And we are going to probably see some defaults on kernels prices, probably technical defaults, but nonetheless, I would class them as defaults. Also look out for aspects on kernel quality. So often when prices are falling, the tendency is to cut corners and kernel quality becomes poorer. And importers often unfairly are accused of calling more quality claims when prices are down. It isn't really the case. When the prices fall, you often see lower quality shipped and problems follow. If we look at raw cashew nuts again, but even more marked, we've seen a sharp decline in price. This chart is for a much shorter period. RCN market being a lot less predictable and in some ways a lot less organized. But certainly prices of raw cashew nuts are at remarkably low levels. We've seen a sharp fall during this season. Of course, the fall in price is due to also not only the market, but also a decline in quality. So we've seen this combination this year of declining quality as the season goes on in West Africa, a falling kernels market, and currency factors. And now to add to that, we're seeing defaults of contract, renegotiation defaults, call them what you will, it amounts to the same thing. So we've seen sharp falls in price, $200 to $225, maybe even a little more in some cases. Effectively, the defaults of contract handing the problems of the processors back to the traders, and the traders will pass it back to the exporters at the origins. And as the year goes on, I expect that those problems indirectly will end up firstly with East African farmers in September, October, and later with West African farmers next year, but more on that later. Key factor is actually not the absolute level of price, in my opinion. The key factor is the volatility of the market. So we look at these periods of volatility, we look at all-time highs, a few years later, 14-year lows. What did this bubble do to the market? What impact did this bubble, these very high prices, RCN over $2,000 a ton, cashew kernels over $4.50 for 320s, what impact has that had on the market? And what does it mean today that that happened back in 2018, 2019? So when we look at it, first thing we should look at is production. So what's been the impact of that bubble on production? And we can see an impact. During that period, Cambodian farmers planted big. They expected high prices. They expected high prices as long as they could see forward. They were wrong, of course. But how would they know any different when everyone was telling them this was the growing market, higher prices would be the thing of the future? In Africa, farmers planted more. We see improving production in Côte d'Ivoire, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Benin. Almost everywhere we look, production has risen somewhat in recent years. So African farmers improved what they do and they planted more trees. Production rose as it would 3 to 5 years later, because that's the time it takes for these impacts to affect supply. So what happened was that production, which was rising relatively slowly and which was beginning to falter and beginning to slow down, suddenly shot upwards, mainly driven by Cambodia, partially driven by increases in production in West Africa. So production growth that had been slowing down now exploded. And that impact was seen from 2020 onwards. A little bit muted in 2020 because of the pandemic, but certainly following on in 2021. This production growth was effectively driven by the speculative bubble of 2016 to 2018. And one thing we should note from that is that investment in production without investment in marketing inevitably leads to lower prices. So now we wait for demand to respond. I said it was driven by Cambodia and the increases in Cambodian production. Let's have a quick look at that. So here we have a chart of production. So you can see the different origins production, and the total production in any given month is the black bars, and the red is the availability. So this is when those tons of raw cashew nuts would be available either in India or in Vietnam to be processed. So what the onset of production in Cambodia did was it shifted the availability sooner, because Cambodia is so close to Vietnam, a couple of days to get your raw cashew nuts into Vietnam. Couple of days, and very cheap too, I think about $80 to $100 a ton. And it increased the production. So not only was it an increase in production, but it was also earlier availability. So the impact of additional production in Cambodia is different to the impact of additional production in West Africa because of the timing of the crop and because of the time taken to bring it to market, which for now at least is in Vietnam. So we look at this production increase, and from 2021 onwards, at least on paper, increases in production in Cambodia tipped the supply-demand balance into a surplus. The scale of this increase was unexpected by most stakeholders. Most of us identified that there was an increase in Cambodian production coming. Few people thought that Cambodian farmers could achieve the kind of yields that they achieved and produce the kind of volumes that they produced. Before the surge in Cambodia, demand and supply were growing at about the same speed. After this surge in production, that fast increase fundamentally altered the supply-demand balance. Because of that increase, it's going to take time. So cashew prices are likely to stay relatively low. That doesn't mean today's levels, but relatively low based on the current trends. Now, lower prices could stimulate demand, especially in Europe and in India. And if that happens, the balance could be restored, but it will take time. And if you look at this and just simply calculate how much growth in demand is needed to absorb the additional production, it works out at about 8 years, incredibly. So continuing on the subject of price volatility, we know that Cambodian farmers planted, African farmers improved, And the RCN trade absolutely exploded. So this is the international trade in raw cashew nuts, simply tons of raw cashew nuts on the line chart, including Cambodia, West Africa, East Africa, Indonesia, and so on. So we saw a trend that the relatively fast rise in production, in trade, in raw cashew nuts from about 2008 onwards, as Cambodian production came online, as the RCN trade expanded, this trend line got much steeper and this RCN trade grew. And to a certain extent, we are today looking at the impact of that. So the raw cashew nut trade, which I would contend was never sustainable, and I mean that both in the economic and environmental sense of the word, a never sustainable trade over a period of years absolutely exploded. Now, it was tempered a little and calmed down somewhat by the onset of the pandemic, interrupted by higher costs, interrupted by supply chain problems during COVID. And you can see in 2020, there was a little downturn. But in the last 2 years, 2021 and 2022, it has turned to massively fast growth, driven last year by India, of course, record imports, but prior to that, by trade from Vietnam. And at the same time, demand growth slowed. So although we saw last year massive trade into India, we've seen a slowing of growth this year. Although we saw very good trade on kernels into Europe and the United States in 2021 and 2022 first half, second half of 2022, a completely different situation. So during this period, what we've seen is margins have gotten tighter, new product launches have slowed, margins for roasters have gotten tighter. The COVID demand spike may have given a false impression, but it was never sustainable. Easy to say that, of course, now, looking back, but we have been saying that the RCN trade was not sustainable for many years. So let's focus in a little bit on price volatility, and we'll have a look at price volatility and how it impacts demand for cashew kernels. So on the screen now, we have a chart which tracks the average high-low price for 320s, that's the orange bars, and the rate of change of demand, mostly growth, on the black line. So this means, for example, that back in 2013, demand grew by 14% and prices were in this rather narrow range. So we can focus in on two periods. We can focus in on this period, 2011 through to early 2016, and that is a period of fast-growing demand. And you can see demand in that period grew in Europe, it grew in India, particularly strong in both of those, but it also grew in China and returned to growth in the United States, where it had been quite sluggish for many, many years. So that period was characterized by relatively stable prices, a lack of price volatility. Now look at the period that followed from 2016 onwards. Now we have much more volatile pattern in demand growth. And that tracks a much more volatile pattern in prices. So prices went higher, collapsed, picked up again, collapsed again. And demand growth pretty much followed that kind of a trend too. We saw a sharp increase in 2019, which was in response to the falling prices toward the end of 2018. We saw a pickup in prices in 2021, a pickup in demand rather in 2021 and 2022. based on the mix of the COVID situation, high consumption, and relatively stable prices. And then from the second half of last year, we saw the collapse. So price volatility is the key factor. And I still would say that the absolute level of price is far less significant for demand growth than the volatility in the price. Who would launch new products at a time when cashews started the year at $4.75 and finished the year at $3.20? Who would increase their volumes in a year when prices started at $3.20 and finished at $4.50? Well, the answer is no good business person would do that. So this kind of a pattern of pricing, as you can see in the orange line, corresponds to a volatile pattern in demand growth. And it takes time. So what I'm saying is that lower prices do not necessarily lead to an immediate change in the demand pattern. It could do, but that would take time. For most people who buy and move cashews, retail them, pack them, it's not a commodity. It's an ingredient. But for most people who talk markets in cashews, they still talk about it as if it was a commodity. Even regulators, they talk about it as if it was a commodity. So this kind of volatility, on top of the unsustainable structure of the raw cashew nut chain, I think leads us into a kind of a vicious circle. So the vicious circle starts with the unsustainable supply chain. Why is it unsustainable? It's unsustainable because 2 million tons of raw cashews move. Most of that product is processed and moves back in the opposite direction. As we've calculated and talked about many times, some cashews move 30,000 kilometers before they get to market, damaging quality, damaging traceability, adding cost, and so on. It's a subject you've heard us talk about on this webinar many times. Unsustainable supply chain, rising production, low buyer confidence post-pandemic. Come back to that in a moment. Slowdown in the economies, the impact of the war by Russia in Ukraine. Add to that weak processors, and I'm mostly focusing on Vietnam, but there are many cases in Africa too. India has its own problems, but it's, in terms of the international market, it's a little bit to one side when it comes to cashew kernels. So we've weak processors offering lower prices to get finance. In other words, get an order at any cost in order to get out of this problem. And why is that? Well, that's because many processors market simply based on price. They look at all the other aspects of marketing as simply barriers to trade to be eliminated. Get your piece of paper for your certification, get your quality spec, and then you start to talk about price. Again, thinking like an old-fashioned commodity trader. This leads to lower raw cashew nut prices at the farm gate and in the international market, which in turn leads to contract defaults on raw cashew nuts, which in turn makes the supply chain less sustainable again, and off we go. And this will eventually be interrupted by the falling production in a response, but that will take time, and it could be interrupted by demand. But meantime, there are a couple of loops here which feed on themselves, feedback loops, so that the contract default of raw cashew nuts contributes to lower raw cashew nut prices, and lower raw cashew nut prices, well, you got it, they contribute to contract defaults too. And that merry-go-round can go on and on for months. On the other side, lower buyer confidence contributes to weaker prices at the origin, and weaker prices at the origin contributes to lower buyer confidence. Why would you buy in a falling market? There's very little reason to make a move. you minimize your purchases. Everyone's looking at what everyone else is doing, and you don't want to be the one that misses the market. So you'll see comments in some of the market reports now that, for example, maybe we're at the bottom of the market. It should pick up from here, but we can't rule out lower prices. That kind of stuff, you'll hear that, you'll read it. It's confusing, and it doesn't mean anything. At the end of the day, we're going to come back to when will demand respond to these lower prices. And the demand will not be responding to giveaway prices from prompt shippers of dubious reputation. It will respond to what can be bought sustainably over a longer period. So this kind of vicious circle, as I'm coming to call it, and I know that's a crude model, but it is a model. It does give us something to think about. What might that do? What might that scenario do for the Vietnamese cashew sector, the leading cashew sector in the world, the biggest importer, the biggest processor? Well, I think in the short term, it could have an impact as follows. Naturally, processors are going to look at their situation. They're going to say, these raw cashew nut contracts are unsustainable. We can't take delivery. We're talking about prices around $1,200, $1,200 plus, compared to maybe today below $1,000. So they're not sustainable, but we still have some kernels that we need to sell. And for many, they want to keep in operation. For others, they will suspend operations or reduce volumes. So what can you do? Well, push sales, delay purchases, and hope for the best. Hope the situation improves. And I think in many ways, from many processors, that's what we see right now. Push the sales, though there will be a limit to that, because if you're delaying your purchases, there will eventually be a limit to what you have to sell or what you can sell. In the longer term, it might lead to something of a rethink in Vietnam. And I'm basing this on a few conversations and on a little bit of reading on what's been talked about in Vietnam. And thanks to a lot of people for opening up on their thoughts. So if we look at the situation right now in Vietnam, we can see that for sure some processors are in trouble. They've had rapid expansion in recent years, but they've been working on low profit margins and possibly no profit margins more recently. That's putting them in a difficult position, puts them in trouble. However, Vietnam still has this superb technology and established processing, the strongest export processor in the world, the best technology, and some of the largest factories that are operating today. On the other hand, there's no control of the sources of supply. 80% of the raw cashew nuts are imported. It's probably more than 80% now. But the market processors do not control it. Contrast that to the Indian situation, where, leaving last year aside, given the huge volume imports, about 55% imported in years prior to that. So to say that you don't have control of 55% of your supply is one thing, but to say you don't have control of 80% plus is quite another. So now you have processors in trouble after rapid expansion, excellent technology in place, but no control of the supply chain. Now you might say, well, about 40% of imports come from Cambodia, so there is a certain amount of control there. Well, maybe there is, but I don't think so. And I think that the Vietnamese cashew sector may have been interested to note the recent developments in policy in Cambodia, talking about increasing processing and increasing value addition, which looks likely to happen in the coming years. They're also, in Vietnam, naturally, like we all are, looking at Africa and saying African processing is on the rise. And they might be looking at it and saying African processing is on the rise using our technology. A Vietnamese processor in trouble could be forgiven for thinking that right now. They'll also observe that African countries, especially in West Africa, are giving high supports to processors, something which is not really the case in Vietnam today. So they might come to the conclusion, and I believe some people are coming to the conclusion, should we just import part processed, maybe shelled, not peeled, further process and export consumer packs, or should we just reduce the volumes that we process but add more value? And some people are saying, and I think it's growing in strength, should there be a tax on partially processed kernels coming into Vietnam? And they must be asking the question in Vietnam as a sector, what will happen to the foreign-owned processing? And a lot of the processing in Vietnam is foreign-owned. What will those companies do? For example, will they move to Africa? There's not much sign of that right now. But there must be a question to be asked. Is it possible that Vietnam would lose its market dominance? Doesn't look likely in the short term, but you can see in these ingredients that it is possible in the medium or longer term. And I think this will draw a response from Vietnamese regulators, from the Vietnamese cashew business sector, and they will seek to fix that. And one initial reaction appears to be add more value, create a roasted or consumer packed product which can be exported in a different way. It's challenging, but it seems to be a direction that Vietnam is looking to go in. So we've talked about price volatility. We've talked about where prices are today. We've talked about some of the market psychology that's at work. One of the big problems and the big questions that's been asked is what's happening with demand. Some people are saying that all the demand has disappeared from the market. That's certainly not true. Some people think that it's only time till we get a major response in demand. Let's have a look at some of the numbers and see what they can tell us on the current demand situation. So we'll focus in on Vietnam. Vietnam is dominant in supplying cashew kernels to major markets around the world. 95+% in China, 89% in the United States, 75% in the European Union. And if we look at exports of cashew kernels in the last 5 months, January through to May of 2023, and this trend has continued in the first half of June too, we've seen in 4 of the months new record exports each month. So you can see the red bars, 2023, February, March, April, May. January was a poor month, compensated for by February perhaps. That might be more to do with the calendar than anything else. But we now are seeing a trend emerging, very healthy exports. If we look at the exports for the year so far, we see that exports up to mid-June are up by around about 9%. I think it's 8.87%. And I think by the end of June, we're going to see a new record for 6 months. You can see here 2022 up to the 15th of June, 2023 to the 15th of June, tons of kernels exported compared to the full 2021. So it wouldn't be surprising to see this number reached or very close to it. And just to put some perspective on this, and we should say, this does not look like a crisis of demand by any means. And if we take a longer term view on it, go right back to 2017 or 2018 and compare it to what we now think is a crisis. And if we compare simply to 2017, exports of cashew kernels from Vietnam are up by 80% since 2017. So since that big speculative price bubble, exports have shot up. But not so in recent years, not so last year. We saw a completely different trend. So let's focus in on the individual markets. So what I've done here is I've taken extracts from the export shipments and made comparisons over the last 4 years. I have excluded 2020 because the first half of the year was obviously highly distorted by the onset of COVID-19. So if we take these regions, Japan and Australia together, the top 7 countries in Europe, the top 6 countries in the Middle East, the United States and Canada together, and China, between them, they would make up about 62% of Vietnamese exports. So they're quite good indicators. So the good news is that if we look at China, which is the red bars, China is back to the numbers we saw in 2021, positive trend, recovered from a poor 2022, which was down to zero COVID policy in China in the early part of the year. The Middle East, and these numbers are somewhat of a surprise to me, I have to say, but we see very strong performance in the Middle East, up 18% on last year, record. Never seen anything at this kind of volume previously. Japan and Australia, about par, maybe slightly down, slightly up, but certainly performing around the levels of recent years. The bad news, on the other hand, is in Europe, where we see the top 7 countries in Europe are down by about 4.5%. To remind you, this is on shipments from Vietnam, not on imports at destination. Shipments from Vietnam, it gives us an earlier signal than imports do. And more worryingly, the US and Canada shipments down by 10% on last year. And last year, first half was slightly down on 2021. Now, if we look at that, we should remind ourselves that the first half of 2022 was very strong in Europe and the United States. It was the second half where we saw that strong fall away. So it may be that the heavy shipments in the early part of 2022 have weighed over inventory-wise, and that's being compensated for now, which would be encouraging for the second half of this year. It might lead us to think that we would see a better second half to 2023 than we did to 2022. And indeed, in the case of the US, it's hard to imagine that the second half of 2023 could be as bad as the second half of 2022. Some of those months were down by 30%. I think one month was 34% lower than the previous year. That's back in 2022. Again, put a bit of perspective on the whole thing. Compared to 2019, 29% higher exports from Vietnam in the first half of the year, to the 15th of June, that is, than in 2019. So again, quite encouraging. Let's move to raw cashew nuts, and we'll have a look at Vietnam. And again, we see quite strong imports of raw cashew nuts into Vietnam. We see an increase of 13% in the January to May period, and 15.6% in the period to the first half of June. So this looks pretty strong. You wonder why all the problems on pricing, but you can see that this is due to a lower kernels market. So to what extent the maintenance of high volume exports on kernels is due to lower prices, there's no way really to know that. But I would say that most contracts are done well in advance. Looking at RCN imports to Vietnam, pretty healthy situation. Let's have a look at some of the major suppliers. So we looked at Cambodia, and you can see that there's a significant decline in trade from Cambodia into Vietnam. Now, we have to be careful on this. It could mean a number of things. It could mean simply the crop is lower. It could mean that there's more informal trade across the border, which hasn't yet shown in the figures. It could also mean that there's a high stock in Cambodia. My guess is that it's a lower crop in Cambodia than was originally forecast. And if you look at the share, so Cambodia's share in the first 5 months of the year of imports to Vietnam of raw cashew nuts declined from 65% to 51%. So that's quite interesting. Now that's higher cost raw material generally. It's also higher quality raw material generally. So it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out. African origins, significant increase in Côte d'Ivoire, significant increase from Tanzania in the early part of the year, significant increase from Ghana. And those will be the early shipments. So that's more likely to be Ghanaian raw cashew nuts than transit raw cashew nuts. And is a significant, although less significant, increase from Nigeria. Let's look at the raw cashew nut trade in India. So based on an estimate of the June figures, we see that imports are slipping back. We're around about 2020 levels, which is by no means an unhealthy figure, but it does look pretty poor compared to last year. Now, two things about that. First of all, we're looking at this period. That's an estimate. These are real figures, if you like. And at that time, the gap was quite narrow. So this could correct itself. On the other hand, the real acceleration in imports last year took place from June arrivals onwards. So it is possible, although I feel it's unlikely at this point in time. So slower than last year, that was always going to happen. We were never going to see India match the kind of huge imports of last year again this year. But we are seeing a slowdown that might be a little bit slower than expected. A lot of factors in play here. A good domestic crop, actually selling at relatively low prices historically, currency factors, and definitely some concerns on kernel demand, although those could easily be rectified over the next 2 months. So we asked earlier, what might Vietnamese stakeholders think? Well, let's have a look at another quite volatile market, the United States, and think about what might a US buyer think. So I'm thinking of a big corporate in this case, and I spoke to a couple of senior people in major snack food corporations. And this is what they were telling me. So they said during the 2020-2022 period, they adjusted their supply chain. They adjusted to the record demand that they were seeing for cashew nuts and other nuts, and they adjusted to the supply chain problems. They built inventories accordingly, and they thought those inventories would clear with continued strong demand in 2022. Of course, it did not. The same supply chain inefficiencies continued to cause problems, and many of those are apparently here to stay. So they're still seeing supply chain inefficiencies. They're still dealing with inventory. And finally, post-pandemic, tree nut demand in the US has been weaker than before the pandemic, and certainly during the pandemic too. Why would demand be weak? Well, we've seen this inflation scare, we've seen energy prices, we've seen concerns on the economy. Maybe nuts, cashew nuts, snack food, eating at home, maybe these things have become associated with the pandemic, associated with lockdown. Maybe people are simply saying, let's go out. Let's not get involved in those foods. And of course, cashews are snack foods rather than food service. So it would impact cashew demand to a certain extent. So they might be thinking, firstly, low prices mean we could promote, and promotions are important in the US market. But we need to clear our inventory first. And higher interest rates mean that not only do we want to clear our excess inventory, but we want to carry less inventory anyway. So the challenge to reduce inventory is there. And in a weak demand period, that's difficult. But why would we hurry anyway? Prices have been falling for 14 months. Every few months, there's panic in Vietnam and prices are knocked down further. Let's just continue to reduce our inventory, take our time, and look for a better opportunity. And I think that might be the kind of thinking that some US buyers are looking at the moment. They also may be thinking, well, other tree nuts are quite cheap. US produced tree nuts are cheap and available. Maybe we should look at them. Maybe they're looking at snack foods and thinking, well, things like chips, extruded snacks, peanuts, better value, cheaper price. Let's promote those first. So a lot of these factors at play. What are the conclusions on demand? Well, I think that, yes, it's true, kernels demand from the US may improve, but it takes 15 to 18 months. Now, we are getting there. I think it's about 14 months since we saw these lower prices. That doesn't mean they were available to buyers at that moment, but we are getting toward the period when these should start to have an impact. But I still think we're going to see some importers, not necessarily US importers, but generally kernels importers, looking to delay their shipments. I think that's largely opportunistic. Mind you, who can blame them if they're getting the same thing from their suppliers when the market is up? We might see that, and that will add to the problem. I think European demand will take longer to recover. The impact on the economy in Europe has been greater. The impact of the war in Europe has been much greater. And so it might take a little bit longer for those factors to be eliminated. Having said that, there are some signs of recovery in Europe on the general economy, but there are also signs of recovery in demand, according to some of the supermarkets. Switching to RCN, as I said, I think Indian RCN demand will be quite good, but it will be down on last year, no question about that. Vietnam RCN demand, well, it's looked pretty positive so far, but it could be disrupted by these problems on kernels. If kernel prices stay where they are, if they get some delays in shipments, if there's slow payments, if there are quality problems, this will eventually reflect back onto RCN. And don't forget, we talked about the two feedback loops, lower prices leading to defaults, leading to lower prices, leading to defaults, and similarly on kernels. Longer run, the disruption in Vietnam could impact the supply of kernels. Now, I don't think that's a huge factor because I think that probably processing and the industry in general in Vietnam is quite flexible at the moment. But the longer the crisis goes on, the less likely factories are to be suitable to bring back into production quickly. Vietnam has a lot of processing capacity, way beyond its current ability to export. So this could impact kernel supply, but that would be short-lived to my mind. So we're looking at a situation where overall demand is probably coming somewhere toward the end of this negative cycle, but that it's going to take some more time. Big questions. How much RCN will India buy this year? Second big question, when will demand in markets like the US respond to lower prices, if it hasn't done so already? So some of these questions and some of the challenges for 2023. First of all, is this a demand crisis? In my opinion, it's a short-term demand crisis, mainly due to inventories and slack demand. I don't think it's due to any fundamental undermining of demand in the cashew sector. In the longer term, there is a crisis. And that crisis is due to the economically and environmentally unsustainable supply chain for raw cashew nuts. And that's not going to go away. It's been there for many years. That problem is not going to go away. In Vietnam, they are looking for solutions. It's not going to be an easy journey, but if we look at the history of the Vietnamese cashew sector, it's pretty likely that they'll find solutions to these problems to sustain their industry. Maybe they'll process less, maybe they'll add more value, but they will find a way. How they do that will have a major impact on the structure of the cashew sector in West Africa. Because if they do reduce their volumes, for example, local RCN prices could crash if there's no processing, if there are not outlets for that. And if those processors, earlier I said producing without marketing always leads to lower prices. Same thing applies. Building processing without marketing and without meeting the buyer's requirements will lead to lower prices too. So the model for processing is also important. And this brings challenges for managing this transition and hopefully managing it proactively. Key factors, and these emerge largely from some of the work we did with the Pro Cashew Project, a great organization to work with, and some of the factors we found with them on policy in West Africa. A couple of factors. Realistic objectives and claims are important to manage the transition proactively. Saying that you'll process 100% of your crop within 2 years, nobody believes it. It has a negative effect and it undermines morale in the sector. Secondly, I think that more responsive pricing mechanisms are necessary. Certainly, it's the right thing to do to protect farmers, to protect incomes of the poorest people in the sector. But we also need more responsive mechanisms to make sure we get the pricing right so the crop will move, and that volatility during the season doesn't bring the whole system to a standstill or force certain people to operate outside the system, effectively forcing them to break the law in order to stay in business. So responsive pricing mechanisms. And then I think the other aspect, and I was recently had some very good conversations in Ghana, a country which handles a lot of transit trade, legally, by the way. But this issue of how to handle cross-border trade, and we're looking Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, we're looking at Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia. These are areas where these are critical issues and they need to be managed very well. But shorter term, I think the key issue emerging now in 2023 for regulators and for the sector in West Africa is to cope with the carry-out inventory. And if we look at the latest estimates from Cote d'Ivoire, for example, CCI informs us the crop is about 1.25 million tonnes, a very large crop. Around about 600,000 tonnes exported at the time of that information release. I'm guessing about 60,000 tonnes has gone across borders. Processors, 250,000 tonnes. Not sure about that really if I look at the trade figures, but that would leave a balance of 340,000 tonnes. Add to that, landed in Vietnam so far from Cote d'Ivoire, about 200,000 tonnes. So if 600 are scheduled or shipped for export and 200 have landed, less what's gone to India, this could mean at the top end that there's a stock of about 340,000 tonnes and a trade incomplete, let's call it, in stock on the water, unpaid for, under contract of about 740,000 tonnes. Now that is a high number, I grant you. That could be a lot less, but it's not less than 500,000 tonnes. And that's a huge number to be in play, so to speak, at this time of year when the market's down and contracts are being defaulted on. Guinea-Bissau, look at the situation into July, shipments only starting, problems of contracts, problems of containers, problems of delays. Will we get another carry-out inventory? I hope not, but based on previous experience, we might do. Looking at Nigeria, very big crop, much slower sales, some poor marketing, sorry to say. Looks like there's an inventory left in Nigeria. So managing, and that's three examples, and I'm picking on those because they're three really important countries. There are others. Managing how this inventory is carried, how it's stored. And we know that cashews, if they're not properly stored, lose value. That is a big challenge for regulators. That's probably the biggest short-term challenge of regulation in the cashew sector. Far bigger than attracting investment in processing or setting minimum prices. Far bigger than the challenge of increasing quality and production. Short term, this can have a long impact. And we've seen that back in 2018 in Tanzania. And if you go back further than that, 10 years back, you'll see similar situations. Big challenges for regulators. Let's have a look at consumption. What are the challenges there? Well, we need to ask, can India return to growth? Now, last year we were asking, will Indian growth price African processing out of the market? Because as we know, it'd be very difficult to compete with Indian processors in a high-value closed market in India. That looks less likely today, but that issue is going to return. Can growth levels return in Europe and in the United States, especially in Europe, which was growing very quickly up to and during the pandemic? So now we're looking at price volatility, sustainability in every sense of the word, food safety, and of course, price competitiveness. Can these markets return to growth? And if you look 21%, plus 19%, plus 36%, there's the answer to the question about the long-term fate of demand. Also, we can add China. It has been growing quickly. It's returning to growth this year. Where will that lead? And not to be forgotten in any of these conversations is the opportunity for local consumption development in sub-Saharan African cashew producers. Countries like Ghana, Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, Tanzania, there's also opportunities there to increase local consumption. Next challenge, and there's quite a few of them, isn't there? How do we support value addition without creating dependent processors? I mean, think of the Indian situation. If Indian processors were not protected by high import tariffs on kernels or a ban on kernels, Vietnamese kernels would surge into Vietnam. Vietnamese processors would be effectively out of business. Look at the situation in Vietnam itself. So let's go back. And we saw processing move from East Africa to India in the 1970s, from India to Vietnam in the 1990s and beyond. And now it's beginning to shift to Africa. Is that the future? Is that more sustainable? Certainly. But is it economically feasible? And that question still remains to be answered by many factories, although there are some doing a great job and making money. So these factors need to address questions like, what will the reaction be in Vietnam to the current situation? And that has a huge impact on African processing. How will the Indian market behave? Will Indian growth be like it was last year or be like it was in the first quarter of this year? How will that impact demand for raw cashew nuts? How will African processors compete with that? And can African processors use their advantages, being close, for example, to these markets, being traceable, being sustainable, fresh products? Can these advantages be used to make African processing more competitive? And it asks the big question, for example, continued extension of subsidies in some countries. Is it right to continue to support and subsidize loss-making factories when there are other factories who are doing well and making money? How do you manage that? Is just having the volume processed more important, or is it having an industry that'll be robust and strong into the future? How can you find the balance between the two? So on the horizon, 2023-24, I think continued rationalization in Vietnam, characterized by more finished products being exported. Rationalization in West Africa, questions about where, questions about how much, questions about how to support processing. This Production rise in Cambodia, I think, is going to slow down. I think it has slowed down, actually. And I don't think it's going to come back too soon, but watch what happens in Cambodia because we will see more developments there. More processing in Tanzania. It is recovering. Factories being opened, and some of them are great factories too. Keep an eye on that. And the big question there is, can we see cost efficiency in African processing? The answer for some is yes, it's already there. For others, well, the jury's still out for many of them. And we do need to keep an eye on that too. Also in 2023-2024, El Nino, very strong event is predicted. We don't see the impact of that just yet in the key areas, but in the past, hot and dry during flowering in Southeast Asia and possibly South India, according to the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. So this could impact flowering this year and monsoon next year. Does it mean anything? Well, it may be coincidence, but if you look for two major rallies in cashew prices in recent years, they both coincided with very strong El Nino events. Particularly the 97-98 one, which was driven by a fall in production in South India. Perhaps less so later, which was driven by lower production in Vietnam, which turned into an incredible speculative bubble. But this is something that does need to be watched very carefully. Some of the big questions to be answered this year. Is this chain that we all work in aligned with customer needs? And I'm talking kernels now. Can African export infrastructure cope with slower shipments and more production? That's what we're seeing now. Slower shipments, Guinea-Bissau, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria. More production, slower shipments. How does the infrastructure protect the product? How is it financed? How is the quality maintained? Are the regulators equipped to make good decisions? Are they armed with the information? Do they have the tools to make good decisions? And we talked about handling inventories. We talked about claims, objectives. We talked about subsidies during our conversation this morning. How are regulators going to manage that? And it's a big challenge. And what about growers? We've seen a fall in prices. We've seen farm gate prices in some countries way below the minimum recommended levels. So longer term, can cashew offer growers a way out of low incomes in order to incentivize production? We probably don't need any more production right now, but we will. And we'll need more and we'll need better in the future. But if we're looking at prices as low as they've crashed to in some cases this year, I think farmers might find some better things to do. And that also needs to be considered. And finally, and looking particularly at the raw cashew nut chain, we need to ask ourselves, is this sustainable in an era of climate change? You know my opinion. I've mentioned it often enough. But we really need to look at this. How is our industry behaving in terms of climate change, and how can that damage us? And not just in terms of money, because if we think just in terms of money, we're thinking again like traders and we're asking for more price volatility, and you know where that leads. But we do need to ask this question and look at the industry in this way. So big questions, big challenges, volatile markets, interesting times. Thanks very much indeed. I'll hand you back to Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the period for question and answer. So if you'd like to ask your question directly, you may use the raise your hand feature. Otherwise, you can also use the Q&A button. Jim, we have some questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to read them out. The first one says, hello, Jim. You mentioned there's a decline in quality. How can these be averted, especially for kernels coming from Africa, where the best of technology is not available? The follow-up question says, is there a correlation between technology and quality of kernels?
Let me start again. I think it's a great question. Thank you very much for the question. We've definitely seen a decline in quality over a protracted period. There's been a lot of corner cutting, for want of a better word. I'm not sure that the best of technology is not available in Africa. I think the choices of technology is important. I think there is a correlation between choices of technology and quality of kernels. But one of the most important ways to protect the quality of the kernels is, before it even gets to the factory, to build a supply chain that sources kernels, educates suppliers, works with suppliers in order to protect quality. A lot of the cashew kernels that I've seen cashew kernels from businesses like Coastal Nuts in Tanzania, from Cashew Coast in Cote d'Ivoire, from Fludor and others in Benin. And I'm looking at really good quality that, frankly, is not possible in other places. So I think that what we need to do is talk to buyers to make sure we're producing the quality they want and get their reaction to the quality. Talk to suppliers to educate them, particularly on post-harvest handling, to make sure we pay them reasonable prices to incentivize that handling, and to make sure that our selection of technology at the outset is right. It's very difficult if you don't do it right in the beginning. It's very difficult to put it right. It's expensive. It takes time. So yes, there is a correlation. Yes, there has been a decline. Change it. Simple interventions. Supply chain, buyers, supply chain, choice of technology. And of course, governments and NGOs can help too by offering training to cashew managers, which is really important and something that's missing. So good question. Thanks very much indeed. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. The next question, is sustainability in Africa truly attainable?
We can ask that question. Let's answer it the easy way first. Relatively speaking, relative to other processing regions, relative to other production regions, is it truly attainable? Well, yes, it is. Compared to importing 80% or 55% of your raw cashew nuts, it's much more likely that the African cashew sector would be sustainable than any other cashew sector based on imported raw nuts. Processing locally produced raw nuts, of course, is equally sustainable, number one. Secondly, is processing cashews a sustainable activity? Well, on the environmental aspect, it is, so long as the byproducts are managed properly. If we think about the use of resources in processing cashews, if we think about the proximity to market, if we think about the impact of trees, provided they're planted in the right way, I think it is attainable in that sense. There's a lot of work to be done on that. Is it more likely to happen in Africa than elsewhere? Most definitely. And therefore, I think it is attainable. Of course, there's the other aspect to sustainability, the economic aspect. I also believe that that is possible. And I can see, pointing to examples, I can see that people are already achieving that. And those success stories can be lessons for us all. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. So the next question is, what do you think about partnership between Vietnam and Africa on the impact of processed nuts in exchange for technology?
Okay, so I'm assuming that that question is suggesting that part processed nuts be sent to Vietnam in exchange for technology. I think it's a ridiculous idea. I think it's completely unsustainable. I think it goes against all of the ideas of developing indigenous industry. I think it goes against the ideas of sustainability. And I think it's an unequal exchange anyway. That technology is available. You don't have to get involved in part processing. So I think that it is a kind of a topic that gets hijacked every now and again, but in the fullness of time will be shown to be really not a good idea. Blessing.
Thank you, Jim. The last question here in the chat says, managing prices. This has not been effective in Africa. How can this change?
I mean, we talked about volatility, so this is a really tough job. I mean, maybe managing prices has been more effective than we think. We would have to measure to what extent are the higher prices at the farm gate over the last decade due simply to the market, and to what extent are they due to the management of prices at the farm gate? I presume the questioner refers to regulation of prices at the farm gate. For me, making it more effective means better market information. It means that regulators have to be more aware of the market. It means that the level of communication between regulators and the sector in general, from growers all the way through to exporters of raw cashew nuts and processors, and maybe even kernels buyers, needs to be more effective. I think independent African shared or national market information databases are essential. I think openness and transparency in the discussion is essential. But the key thing for me is to train regulators, help regulators to understand how the market works and what it means for them, and to try and discourage them, and I understand why, but to try and discourage them from being overly influenced by the immediate political expediency and focus on the reality of the market at any given time. It's a big job. How can it change? There's some ideas. One thing's for sure, it needs to change. It does need to improve. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. The next question says, you talked about prices and price. How long should we expect this?
Please repeat that question, Blessing.
You've talked about prices and price, and the person wants to know how long would this last?
Well, I think we will see improved prices on cashew kernels in the coming months. I'm not saying this week, next week, or next month, but I think in the coming months we will see improved prices. The market has dipped down to these levels before and bounced back a little bit. I do not think that in 2023 we will see the fundamental answer to this pricing issue. I do not think that raw cashew nut prices will recover quickly. I think that 2024 will be better. But frankly, what we would be best to see is a rise in price, maybe back towards around $2.90 to $3 for 320s, and that the market would stay at that level. What we found, if you look back at 2011, in fact, you can see the chart on the screen. If you go back to the period of price stability, prices were in the range $3, $3.20. That seemed to work for everyone. Demand went up, production went up, trade went up. So around about those levels seemed to work, or at least seemed to work at that time. Costs are a little bit higher now, so maybe that's not quite attainable. For me, when slowly this year, more sustainably, more quickly next year after the crop. So this is still quite a way away. I certainly, I wouldn't be speculating on this. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. We have really exhausted all the questions in the chat. But just before we bring the session to an end, Jim, what should we look out for in the next 2 weeks before the next GNE?
More of the same, I'm afraid. More crisis in raw cashew nut trade. Probably a relatively quiet period in cashew kernels. Maybe some prompt buying to continue. I think beyond that, you'll see a little bit more buying during August. Big question really now is how the raw cashew nut shipment trade works out. I mean, people have been walking away from contracts. They have been sacrificing some of their deposits. The deposits are insignificant compared to the contract price differences. How that's managed would be a key thing. I do not feel that the market is going to spark to life on kernels in the next 2 weeks, but I think it might come a little bit more to life over the next 6 weeks or so. I'll be following with interest also the reactions of some of the governments and regulators in West Africa, some of the tinkering that's going on to try and manage the situation, and particularly to manage the likely carryout. I hope they get it right. I know that they're working on it. And I'll also be watching with interest the results of various discussions and meetings in India that have been held recently to discuss the processing of cashews and the cashew market in India. It'll be very interesting to see if there's any action to come from those meetings, perhaps in support of Indian processors. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. We'll be sure to look out for those. And maybe closing remarks before we bring the session to an end.
Be careful. This is a very volatile market. That's not going to change anytime soon. Two things: be careful. Obviously, be careful of what you do in the market, but more than anything, be careful of who you do it with. The reliability of contract partners on all sides comes into question in periods of volatility. So choose your friends wisely and choose your customers and suppliers even more wisely. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. It's great to talk to you, and you can see my contacts on the screen. If you ever want to contact me, feel free to do so. Thanks very much indeed. All the best for now.
Thank you very much, Jim. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of another session of the ACA Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Then on behalf of the African Cashew Alliance, we appreciate our partners and sponsors for making it possible for us to bring this session to you. Just to inform us all that we are 75 days to the 17th ACA Annual Cashew Conference. Registration has started, and we have special rates for early birds. We ask that you register to book your seats. And also be informed that the next session of the GMU will take place in 2 weeks. We hope to see you again then, and until then, please do stay safe. Bye-bye.
The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this.
Recording stopped.